To give you some context, this happened back in November of 2016. I was 19 at the time, living in a small, rural town in northern Minnesota. It was one of those places where winter hits early, and by 5 p.m. it's already pitch black outside. I had a friend named Tyler who was unparalleled when it came to urban exploration. We had exhausted all the usual spots, the old grain silo, the abandoned railway tunnel, and the empty factories downtown. But one Tuesday night, Tyler called me around 7:30 p.m. He sounded different, more excited than usual. He told me he found a coordinate online for an old hunter's cabin deep in the Iron Range woods that had supposedly been vacant since the late 90s. I wasn't really in the mood to go out. I was comfortable in my room, just watching Family Guy reruns and eating leftovers. But Tyler was persistent, and honestly, there wasn't much else to do in our town on a Tuesday night. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. He picked me up in his beat-up Ford Taurus about 20 minutes later. The drive was long and quiet. We turned off the main highway onto a gravel logging road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the forest. The trees were dense, their branches heavy with the first snow of the season, creating a tunnel-like effect that made me feel claustrophobic, even though we were outside. We parked the car at a dead end where the road was washed out. According to Tyler's GPS, we had to hike about a mile inward. I remember checking my phone. It was 8:42 p.m. The air was biting cold, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the frozen leaves and the distant howling of wind through the pines. When we finally reached the clearing, the cabin didn't look like I expected. It wasn't a small shack. It was a sturdy, two-story log structure, though the roof had partially collapsed on the left side. The windows were boarded up with plywood that had grayed and rotted over time. "This is it," Tyler whispered, though there was no one around to hear us. We circled the perimeter until we found a cellar door around the back. The padlock was rusted through, and with a solid kick from Tyler, the wood splintered and the doors fell open, revealing a concrete staircase descending into darkness. The smell hit us first. It wasn't just the smell of mold or old wood. It was something copper-like, almost metallic, mixed with damp earth. We clicked on our flashlights and headed down. The beam of my light cut through the dust particles floating in the stagnant air. The basement was surprisingly furnished. There was a workbench covered in rusted tools, an old wood stove, and in the far corner, a large wooden chest. It looked out of place compared to the decay around it. The wood was polished, dark, and seemingly untouched by the dampness. Tyler, being the reckless one, walked straight over to it. "Check this out," he said, lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1998, was a wooden carving. It wasn't a doll, exactly. It looked like a totem or an effigy, about 2 feet tall, carved from a single piece of pale wood. It depicted a figure with elongated limbs and a face that had no eyes, just a wide, open mouth screaming in silence. It was disturbing, to say the least. I got a bad gut feeling immediately. "Dude, put that back. Let's just look around and go," I said. Tyler laughed. "Relax, it's just a piece of wood." He pulled it out and started mocking it, making it dance in the air. Then, trying to be funny, he bent the figure's arm back. Snap! The sound was incredibly loud in the small concrete room. It sounded like a dry branch breaking, but wetter somehow. The arm of the effigy hung limp, attached only by a few splinters. "Nice going," I muttered. "Whatever," Tyler said, tossing the broken carving back into the open chest. He didn't even bother to wrap it back up. "This place is boring anyway. Let's check the upstairs." We spent another 20 minutes exploring the upper floors, but the floorboards were too rotted to trust, so we decided to call it a night. We hiked back to the car, the adrenaline fading into fatigue. We got to the car, and Tyler reached into his pocket for his keys. He froze. He patted his jacket, then his jeans, then checked the ignition. "You're kidding me," I said. I must have dropped them when I kicked the cellar door, Tyler said, looking pale. Or maybe inside. We had no choice. We had to go back. The walk back felt longer this time. The woods seemed quieter, if that was even possible. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence. When we got back to the cabin, the cellar doors were still open, gaping like a black mouth in the snow. I'll check the stairs, you check the room, Tyler said, his voice shaking slightly. I walked down into the basement, sweeping my flashlight across the floor. No keys. I moved toward the workbench, then toward the chest. I froze. The chest was closed. I vividly remembered Tyler leaving it open. He had tossed the carving in and walked away. I felt a cold chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Tyler?" I called out. "Find them?" he yelled from the stairs. "Did you close the chest?" "No, why?" I swallowed hard and stepped closer. I had to know. I reached out and lifted the heavy wooden lid. My heart hammered against my ribs. The carving was sitting on top of the newspapers, but it wasn't broken. The arm that Tyler had snapped, the arm that was hanging by splinters, was perfectly attached. There was no glue marks, no tape, not even a crack in the wood. It was smooth, solid, and whole. But that wasn't the worst part. The figure's position had changed. Instead of the arms being at its sides, its hands were now covering its ears and the mouth. The mouth was closed. "I found them!" Tyler shouted from outside, startling me so bad I nearly dropped the flashlight. "They were in the snow by the door." "We need to go, now," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned to run, but then I heard it. It came from the chest behind me. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was a sound of wood grinding on wood, slow and deliberate. Scrape. I spun around, shining my light back at the chest. The carving was trembling. It was vibrating, rattling against the wood of the box. Then a sound filled the room that I can't explain. It sounded like a mimicry. It was a voice, but it sounded flat, hollow, and devoid of breath. "Nice going." It was my voice. It was repeating exactly what I had said earlier, but distorted, like a corrupted audio file. I didn't wait to see more. I sprinted up those stairs faster than I ever have in my life. I nearly collided with Tyler at the top. "Drive!" I screamed, pushing him toward the trail. We ran blindly through the woods, tripping over roots and tearing our jackets on branches. We didn't stop until we were inside the Taurus with the doors locked. Tyler didn't ask questions. He saw the look on my face. He gunned the engine, and we sped down that logging road, nearly sliding into a ditch twice. We didn't speak for the entire ride home. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I saw, or what I heard. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the acoustics of the basement. But here is the part that keeps me up at night. A few days later, Tyler texted me. He sent a picture of his arm. "Did you hit me when we were running?" he asked. On his right forearm, exactly where he had snapped the carving's arm, was a massive, deep purple bruise. It wasn't just a blob, though. The bruise wrapped all the way around his arm, forming the distinct shape of 4 long fingers and a thumb, squeezing tight. We stopped hanging out after that. I think he knew I was hiding something, or maybe he was just as scared as I was. I moved away for college a year later and haven't been back to that town since. But sometimes, when it's really quiet in my apartment and the heating pipes settle, I hear that sound, that dry, wooden snap. And I get the feeling that somewhere, in a basement deep in the woods, that thing has taken its hands off its ears, and it's listening. My name is Chris, and back in 2018, I took a job that I thought would be the easiest paycheck of my life. I was 23, fresh out of college with a useless degree and drowning in student debt. I found a listing on Craigslist for a night shift security guard at a decommissioned water treatment facility about 40 miles outside of Seattle. The place was called the Harrow Creek Filtration Plant. It had been shut down since the late 90s due to some environmental regulation shifts, but the city still paid a private firm to keep an eye on it to prevent copper theft and vandalism. The job description was simple. Sit in the guard booth, watch the perimeter cameras, and do one physical round of the facility every 2 hours. The first 2 weeks were exactly what you'd expect. Boring. The facility was a massive, brutalist concrete complex surrounded by dense pine forest. At night, the silence out there was heavy. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional settling of the old building's foundation. It was a Tuesday night in October when things changed. I remember the date exactly, October 16th, because I had just brought a new book with me to kill time. I clocked in at 10 p.m., relieving the evening guy, an older man named Earl, who always looked like he was in a rush to leave. "Quiet night," Earl muttered, handing me the keys. "Check the gauges in the lower levels if you get a chance. The humidity sensor's been acting up." I nodded, locked the main gate behind him, and settled into the booth. I spent the first few hours reading and scrolling through Reddit on my phone. The CCTV monitors showed nothing but grain and static-filled views of empty corridors and the overgrown parking lot. Around 12:45 a.m., I decided to do my first round. I grabbed my mag light and the radio, though I knew no one was on the other end at this hour. The air inside the plant was stale, smelling of wet concrete and rust. It was cold, the kind of damp cold that seeps right through your jacket. I walked through the main intake hall, checking the doors. Everything was locked tight. I was heading toward the administrative wing when I heard it. Ka-chunk! It was the distinct, heavy sound of the main steel fire door at the far end of the hallway, opening and slamming shut. This wasn't a light wooden door. These were industrial-grade steel doors with heavy magnetic latches. To open one, you had to put your shoulder into it. I froze. My first thought wasn't ghosts, it was scrappers. We had been warned that meth heads sometimes tried to break in to steal the wiring. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed weirdly in the long, empty corridor. "Security, make yourself known!" Silence. I unclipped the pepper spray from my belt, we weren't allowed guns, and walked toward the sound. I reached the door at the end of the hall. It was closed. I tried the handle. Locked. I pushed it. It didn't budge. I felt a weird knot form in my stomach. I knew I had heard that door slam. The acoustics in this place were tricky, though. Maybe it was a pressure change in the ventilation system? I tried to rationalize it. The building was old. Old buildings make noise. I finished the round quickly, feeling like eyes were on the back of my neck the whole time. I got back to the guard booth, locked the door, and turned up the brightness on the monitors. I sat there for an hour, just staring at the feeds, waiting for movement. Nothing. At 2:30 a.m., I had to go down to the lower levels to check the humidity sensor Earl had mentioned. I really didn't want to leave the booth, but I needed to log the check in the system or I'd get docked pay. To get to the lower levels, you had to take a service elevator that hadn't worked in 20 years, or use the stairwell. I took the stairs. Down, past the basement, past the sub-basement, all the way to sub-level 3. This area was essentially a maze of massive pipes, catwalks, and old turbine machinery. It was below the water table, so the air was thick and smelled aggressively of mold and stagnant water. The only light came from the emergency strips on the walls, casting everything in a sickly yellow-green glow. I walked along the metal catwalk, my boots clanging loudly on the grate. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was deafening in the silence. I reached the sensor array, logged the numbers on my clipboard, and turned to leave. That's when I heard the noise again. But this time, it wasn't a door. From somewhere deep in the darkness below the catwalk, where the massive intake pipes ran into the earth, I heard a metallic rhythm. Bang, bang, bang. 3 distinct, heavy hits against metal. I stopped dead in my tracks. The hair on my arms stood up. It sounded like someone hitting a wrench against one of the main drainage pipes. "Is someone down there?" I shouted, shining my light through the grate of the catwalk. The beam just illuminated dirty water and rusting metal pipes that disappeared into the concrete floor. Silence followed. Then, about 10 seconds later, bang, bang, bang. The exact same rhythm, the exact same force. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't the wind. This was deliberate. A scrapper must have gotten down there and was trying to pry something loose. I was angry now, mostly to cover up the fear. "Hey, I'm calling the police!" I yelled. To emphasize my point, I stomped my boot hard on the metal catwalk grate 3 times. Stomp, stomp, stomp. I waited, expecting to hear someone scrambling to run away. What happened next is the reason I can't sleep without a fan on to this day. Almost immediately, less than a second after my last stomp, the sound came back from the pipes below. Bang, bang, bang. It wasn't an echo. An echo is softer, fading. This was louder. It was aggressive. It was mocking me. I stood there, paralyzed. My brain was trying to process it. Maybe it was just physics? Maybe the vibration of my stomps traveled down the support beams and shook the pipes? I had to be sure. I didn't want to report a break-in if it was just plumbing noise. I took a breath, gripped the railing, and tapped my flashlight against the metal handrail. I did a specific pattern this time. 2 fast taps, a pause, and 1 slow tap. Clink, clink, clink. I held my breath. From the blackness below, the sound returned instantly. Bang, bang, bang. It mimicked the rhythm perfectly, but the sound, it had changed. The first times, it sounded like metal on metal. This time, it sounded wet. It sounded like something slapping the inside of the hollow pipe with tremendous force. And then, before I could even move, the sound escalated. It didn't stop at 3. Bang, 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 bang! The noises started moving. They weren't coming from one spot anymore. They were traveling up the length of the vertical pipe that ran alongside the catwalk I was standing on. Something was inside the pipe, and it was climbing. The heavy thuds were getting closer to my level, rising from the darkness at an impossible speed. Thud, thud, thud. I scrambled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. I turned and sprinted toward the stairwell. Behind me, the banging stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard a sound that chilled me more than the banging. It was a sound like a pressure seal being released. Hiss. The maintenance hatch on the pipe, about 20 feet behind where I had been standing, began to screech. It was a rusted, bolt-sealed hatch. It shouldn't have been able to open, but I could hear the metal groaning as something pushed against it from the inside. Screech! I didn't look back. I hit the stairs and took them 2 at a time, my lungs burning, my legs pumping on pure adrenaline. I burst through the door to the ground floor, slammed it shut, and didn't stop running until I was inside the guard booth. I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. I was hyperventilating, staring at the monitors. I looked at the camera feed for the hallway leading to the stairwell door, the one I had just exited. The door was slowly opening. I watched on the grainy black and white screen as the heavy steel door swung outward. There was no one there. No figure pushed it. It just opened, held for a moment, and then slammed shut. Ka-chunk! I could hear the slam all the way from the booth. I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, and drove. I didn't lock the gate. I didn't clock out. I just drove until I was back in the city lights of Seattle. I quit the next morning via email. I told them I had a family emergency and couldn't return. I didn't care about the paycheck. A few months later, curiosity got the better of me. I started digging into the history of the Harrow Creek plant. I found an archived article from a local paper in 1994. Apparently, 2 maintenance workers had gone missing during a routine inspection of the intake valves in sub-level 3. They searched the pipes for days. They never found bodies, but they found their tools. To give some context, this story takes place in the summer of 2015. I was 20 years old at the time, a junior in college, and like most students, I was desperate for cash. My roommate, a guy named Josh, told me about a gig his uncle had lined up. His uncle had just purchased a defunct summer camp in the Adirondacks, Camp Silverwood, and needed a small crew to go up there for a weekend to clear out the main lodge and the infirmary before the professional contractors came in to renovate. It sounded easy enough. 2 days of hauling out old mattresses and sweeping dust for $500 cash. Josh, myself, and his girlfriend Maya drove up on a Friday afternoon. The drive was standard for upstate New York, long stretches of highway that eventually turned into winding, single-lane roads flanked by dense forests. By the time we hit the gravel access road to the camp, we lost cell service completely. I remember checking my phone and seeing the "no service" icon. It gave me a slight pang of anxiety, but I brushed it off. We were only going to be there for 2 nights. The camp had been closed since 2004, and nature was already reclaiming it. Weeds were waist-high around the cabins, and the paint on the main signage was peeling in long gray strips. The main lodge, a massive A-frame structure made of dark timber, sat at the top of a hill overlooking a stagnant green lake. We spent the first few hours unloading our gear. Since the cabins looked structurally questionable and smelled like dead animals, we decided to set up our sleeping bags in the main lodge's great room. It was a huge open space with a stone fireplace and vaulted ceilings. It felt safer than being separated in the small cabins. Everything was normal until the second day. We had spent the morning clearing out the dining hall, which was mostly just tedious work. Around 2 p.m., Josh asked me to head over to the infirmary building to start boxing up any old medical supplies or paperwork left behind. The infirmary was a small, white building set apart from the rest of the camp, nestled right against the tree line. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, the air felt different. You know that feeling when you walk into a room where an argument just happened? The air feels heavy, charged with static. It was like that, but colder. I unlocked the door, which was surprisingly difficult, the key fighting me the whole way, and stepped inside. The smell hit me instantly. It wasn't the smell of rot or mold, which I had expected. It was the smell of rubbing alcohol and iodine. It was sharp and clinical, piercing through the musty air. It didn't make sense. This place had been abandoned for over a decade. Those chemicals should have evaporated years ago. I started in the back office, tossing old clipboards and rusted instruments into a trash bag. I was working with my back to the hallway that led to the recovery rooms. About 20 minutes in, I got this sudden, overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. It started as a prickling on the back of my neck, the kind of primal instinct that tells you a predator is watching. I stopped what I was doing and listened. Silence. Just the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. "Josh?" I called out. thinking maybe he had finished in the lodge and walked over. No answer. I turned around to look down the hallway. At the far end, there was a door that I was 100% certain I had closed when I did my initial walkthrough. It was the door to the quarantine room. It was now standing wide open. And inside that room, the shadows seemed darker. It sounds cliché, I know, but looking into that room felt like looking into a void. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was a physical presence of darkness, like a black cloud of smoke was pooling in the corner of the ceiling. My stomach dropped. A wave of nausea washed over me so intense, I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself. I didn't go investigate. I didn't try to be a hero. I grabbed my trash bag, walked out the front door, locked it, and practically jogged back to the main lodge. When I told Josh and Maya, they laughed it off. Josh said it was probably just a draft or the building settling. "It's an old wooden box in the woods, man. It breathes," he said. I didn't argue, but I didn't go back to the infirmary. That night, the weather turned. A heavy summer storm rolled in around 10 p.m., bringing thunder that shook the floorboards of the lodge. We built a fire in the stone fireplace, ate some sandwiches, and tried to ignore the howling wind. By midnight, the rain was hammering against the roof so hard it sounded like gravel. We laid our sleeping bags out in the center of the room, facing the fireplace. Maya was in the middle, Josh on the left, and I was on the right. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the high ceiling. I fell asleep around 12:30, listening to the rain. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. You know how sometimes you wake up groggy and confused? This wasn't that. I woke up instantly alert, my eyes snapping open, my heart already hammering against my ribs. The rain had stopped. The silence in the lodge was absolute. I lay there, staring at the ceiling beams, trying to figure out what had woken me. I felt an intense cold. Not a draft, but a localized cold, right next to me. Then I heard it. It was directly beside my right ear. It was the sound of an intake of breath. Wet, rattling, and incredibly slow. It sounded like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to breathe through a crushed windpipe. My entire body locked up. I couldn't move. I couldn't turn my head. I just lay there, staring straight up, tears welling in my eyes from sheer terror. The breathing continued. I could feel the warmth of the breath against my ear. It smelled terrible, like copper and spoiled meat. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was Josh? Maybe he had rolled over. But Josh was on the other side of Maya, at least 6 feet away. There was nothing to my right but empty floor space and the wall. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. I started counting in my head, trying to ground myself. 1, 2, 3. Suddenly, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt like the air in the room had been sucked out. Then, without warning, a sound erupted that I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a scream. It was a shriek. A high-pitched, piercing wail that sounded distinctively female, but distorted, like a human voice pushed through a broken speaker. Eee! It was so loud, my ears physically popped. "What the fuck?" Josh screamed, scrambling out of his sleeping bag. Maya was screaming, thrashing around in her bag. I bolted upright, fumbling for my flashlight. I clicked it on and swept the beam across the room. There was no one there. The lodge was empty. The doors were still bolted from the inside. The windows were intact. "Did you hear that?" Maya was sobbing, clutching Josh's arm. "It was right on top of me. It was right in my face." "I heard it," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to go. Now." We didn't pack. We didn't grab the trash bags we had filled. We grabbed our keys, our phones, and our wallets, and we ran. We burst out of the lodge into the damp night air. The mud sucked at our boots as we sprinted for Josh's Subaru. I fully expected to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, maybe that dark shape from the infirmary, but there was nothing but trees and mist. We piled into the car. Josh's hands were shaking so bad he dropped the keys between the seats. "Find them! Find them!" I yelled, looking out the back window. He found them, jammed the key into the ignition, and the car roared to life. We peeled out of that gravel lot, tires spinning, kicking up mud and rocks. We drove in silence for the first 20 minutes, speeding dangerously fast down those winding roads until we saw the lights of the nearest town. We stopped at a 24-hour diner just to be around people and light. We sat in a booth, shivering, drinking terrible coffee, trying to make sense of it. Maya swore that right before the scream, she felt a hand brush against her face. She said it felt like ice. We never went back to finish the job. Josh told his uncle that we got sick and couldn't complete the work. He never mentions the breathing or the scream. His uncle was annoyed but hired a local contractor to finish it. About 2 months later, Josh called me. He sounded weird. "You remember the infirmary?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I try not to." My uncle sent me some old photos he found in the records room when the contractors were finished. Apparently, back in the 70s, the camp had a tuberculosis outbreak. They used the infirmary as a quarantine zone. He paused, and I could hear him swallowing hard on the other end of the line. "There was a nurse," he continued. "She refused to leave the kids. She ended up catching it and dying in the camp. The records say she died of respiratory failure, drowning in her own fluids." I felt the blood drain from my face. I thought back to that sound, the wet, rattling breath right next to my ear, the smell of copper. "And Alex?" Josh said quietly. "The room she died in? It was the quarantine room at the end of the hall." I hung up the phone. I haven't spoken to Josh about it since. I know it sounds crazy. I know people say sound carries in old buildings, or that wind can sound like screaming. But wind doesn't breathe. Wind doesn't smell like sickness. I still have trouble sleeping on the floor. If I ever have to sleep on an air mattress or a sleeping bag, I make sure my head is nowhere near open space. I need to be against a wall. Because sometimes, just as I'm drifting off, I can still hear that shallow, wet rattle, waiting for me in the dark. My name is David, and at the time this happened, I was working as a freelance landscape photographer. It was October of 2019, and I had spent the last week shooting the fall foliage in the Smoky Mountains. I was driving a 2011 Subaru Outback, a car that had never given me a single issue in the 3 years I'd owned it. To save time on the drive back to Ohio, I decided to take a shortcut through a remote section of West Virginia. My GPS directed me onto a 2-lane highway called Route 9, not the main one, but an older, winding road that cut through the heart of the coal mining country. It was about 11:30 p.m. when I turned onto it. The first hour was peaceful. The road was empty, flanked on both sides by dense, towering forests that seemed to swallow the light from my high beams. I had a podcast playing, something about unsolved mysteries, ironically, and I was just enjoying the drive. Around 12:45 a.m., the atmosphere changed. A thick fog began to roll down from the mountains. It wasn't a gradual mist. It was a heavy, soupy white wall that reduced my visibility to maybe 10 feet in front of the hood. I had to kill the high beams because the light just reflected back at me, blinding me. I slowed down to a crawl, maybe 15 miles per hour. That's when the normalization of the drive ended. My music cut out. It didn't fade, it just stopped abruptly, the Bluetooth connection severed. A second later, my headlights flickered. Flicker, dim, bright, off. My stomach dropped. I was miles from the nearest town. I tapped the dashboard, praying it was just a loose fuse. The lights came back on, but the engine sputtered. It gave a sickening, grinding cough, and then everything died. The power steering locked up, the dashboard went dark, and the car rolled to a silent halt right in the middle of the road. I sat there for a moment, in the absolute silence. If you've never been in deep woods at night, when it's dead quiet, it's a heavy kind of silence. It feels like pressure in your ears. I tried to turn the key. The engine cranked, chug, 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 but it wouldn't catch. I tried again. Nothing. I pulled out my phone. No service. Of course. I checked the time. 1:03 a.m. I knew I had to get out and check under the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but I know how to check battery terminals. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, zipped up my jacket, and stepped out. The cold was immediate. It was a damp, biting cold that seemed to seep through my clothes instantly. The fog was so thick, I could barely see the back of my own car. I walked to the front, popped the hood, and shone the light around. Everything looked fine. The battery was connected, the belts were intact. I was about to slam the hood shut when I got that feeling. The feeling that I was being watched. It started at the base of my spine and worked its way up to my neck. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Snap. A twig broke somewhere in the woods to my right. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small and pathetic in the open air. "I'm having car trouble. Can you help?" Silence. Then I heard something else. It wasn't footsteps. It was a low, rhythmic humming. It sounded like a group of people humming a single, low note in unison. It was faint, coming from deep within the trees. Panic set in. I slammed the hood and scrambled back into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. I sat there, heart pounding against my ribs, just breathing hard. The humming had stopped. I told myself I was imagining things. It was the wind. It was the stress. I decided to try the engine one more time. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. Chug, chug, chug. Click. "Come on," I whispered, hitting the steering wheel. "Please." I leaned my head back against the headrest, closing my eyes for a second to calm down. When I opened them, I instinctively looked up at the rear-view mirror to check the road behind me. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone in the car. In the back seat, directly behind the passenger side, sat an old man. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was wearing what looked like a dirty, tattered hospital gown that hung loosely off his skeletal frame. His skin was gray, the color of wet ash. But the most terrifying part was how he was moving. He was vibrating. He was shaking so violently that his outline was almost blurry in the dim light. It wasn't just shivering from the cold. It looked like he was having a seizure, but he was completely silent. His jaw was slack, hanging open in a silent scream. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My brain couldn't process how he got in. I had locked the doors. I had heard the locks click. I stared at his reflection in the mirror for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds. He just kept shaking, staring at the back of the passenger seat headrest. Then, slowly, his head began to turn. He wasn't turning his body, just his neck. It moved with a jerky, mechanical motion. Snap, snap, snap. He was turning to look at me in the reflection. Sheer terror broke my paralysis. I screamed, a guttural, raw sound, and spun around in my seat to face him, fumbling for the door handle to bail out. The back seat was empty. There was no one there, just my duffel bag and a tripod case. I sat there, twisted in my seat, hyperventilating. I shone my flashlight all over the back seat. Nothing. No indent on the cushion, no mud on the floor mats. "I'm losing my mind," I whispered to myself. "I'm actually losing my mind." I turned back around, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't care about the engine anymore. I forced the key again, screaming at the car. "Start! Start, damn it!" Vroom. The engine roared to life. I didn't question it. I didn't wait to let it warm up. I threw the car into drive and floored it. The tires spun on the damp asphalt, screeching as I tore off down the road. I drove like a maniac. I took corners way too fast, ignoring the fog, just desperate to get away from that spot. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I refused to. I flipped it up so it was pointing at the ceiling. About 20 miles down the road, I finally saw lights. It was a 24-hour truck stop. I pulled in, parking under the bright halogen lights of the gas pumps. I just sat there for 10 minutes, shaking, trying to stop crying. Finally, I went inside to get a coffee and just to be around another human being. The cashier was an older guy with a grease-stained hat. He looked at me, pale, sweating, shaking, and raised an eyebrow. "You okay, son? Look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed, a hysterical, dry sound. "Car broke down. Back on Route 9, by the mile marker with the old bridge." The cashier's expression changed instantly. He stopped wiping the counter. "You broke down near Harker's Pass?" he asked, his voice dropping. "I guess," I said. "Why?" He leaned in, looking around the empty store. "You didn't get out of the car, did you?" I hesitated. "Yeah, I checked the engine." He shook his head slowly. "You're lucky. Folks don't stop there, not at night." I asked him what he meant. He told me a story that made the hair on my arms stand up again. He said that back in the 70s, there was a state-run psychiatric facility up in those hills. It was shut down due to humane violations. Rumor was the staff were using the patients for other things. Occult things. They said the patients were often found wandering the roads at night, emaciated and terrified, shaking from the withdrawal of whatever experimental drugs they were on. "They say sometimes you can still see them," the cashier said, cleaning a glass, "trying to hitch a ride to get away from the doctors. But they aren't really there anymore. Just echoes." I paid for my coffee and left. I wanted to believe it was just a spooky story to scare tourists. But when I got back to my car, I saw something that froze my blood. The parking lot lights were bright, illuminating the interior of my Subaru. I went to open the driver's side door, and I happened to glance at the rear window, the one on the passenger side, right where the man had been sitting. On the inside of the glass, clear as day, was a handprint. But it wasn't a normal handprint. The fingers were impossibly long, dragging downward through the condensation. And the print wasn't made of oil or dirt. It was made of frost. It was fading quickly in the warmer air of the valley, but I saw it. A perfect, icy handprint on the inside of a car that had the heat blasting for the last 20 minutes. I drove the rest of the way home with the dome light on. I sold the Subaru a month later. I couldn't stand looking in that rearview mirror anymore. Every time I did, I expected to see that gray, shaking face turning to look at me. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night and the signal on the radio starts to fuzzy out, I pull over. I don't care where I am. I get out, check the back seat, and make sure I'm truly alone. Because I know what I saw. And I know that for a few seconds, on that dark road in West Virginia, something was in the car with me. To give you some background, I've lived in Chicago my entire life. I'm used to weird things. If you ride the CTA, specifically the Blue Line, at odd hours, you see everything. Drunks, fights, people talking to themselves. It all becomes background noise after a while. You learn to just put your headphones in, stare at your phone, and mind your own business. But what happened to me in the winter of 2019 made me buy a car. I haven't stepped foot on a train platform since. I was 24 at the time, working as a jagged shift paralegal for a firm downtown. We were in the middle of a massive class action lawsuit, which meant I was often at the office until 3 or 4 in the morning preparing discovery documents. It was a Tuesday in mid-February, the kind of cold where the wind feels like it's physically slapping you. I clocked out at 3:45 a.m. and walked the 3 blocks to the Monroe station. The city is usually quiet at that hour, but that night it felt dead. The streets were covered in that dirty gray slush that accumulates in the gutters, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I walked down the stairs into the station. The smell hit me first, that distinct mix of ozone, stale urine, and damp concrete that every Chicago commuter knows. It was warmer down there, but the air felt stagnant. I swiped my Ventra card and pushed through the turnstile. The platform was completely empty. I checked the digital board. Forest Park, 12 minutes. Great. I sat down on one of the metal benches, pulling my scarf tighter around my face. I remember taking out my phone to check Instagram, just trying to zone out. The station was eerily quiet. Usually you can hear the rats scurrying in the tracks or the low hum of the ventilation. But tonight, it was just silence. Normalization is a funny thing. You tell yourself everything is fine because it has to be. About 5 minutes passed. I was staring at the advertisement across the tracks, some personal injury lawyer billboard, when I heard it. Click, clack, click, clack. Footsteps. But not normal footsteps. These sounded hard, deliberate, like dress shoes on tile. They were coming from the far end of the platform, near the emergency exit stairs. I didn't look up immediately. Like I said, you learn to ignore people. But the rhythm was off. It was too slow. Click, clack, click. Curiosity got the better of me. I glanced to my left. Standing about 50 feet away, just at the edge of where the fluorescent lights start to dim, was a man. He looked completely out of place for 4 a.m. on a Tuesday. He was wearing a pristine charcoal gray suit, the kind that looks expensive. He had a matching fedora hat, which struck me as odd because nobody really wears those anymore unless they're trying too hard. He was holding a briefcase in his left hand. But it wasn't his clothes that unsettled me. It was his posture. He was standing perfectly still, facing the tiled wall. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't looking at the tracks. He was just standing there, nose almost touching the dirty white tiles, rigid as a board. I got that gut feeling immediately. You know the one, the primal alarm bell in your lizard brain that says, "Predator, run." I tried to rationalize it. He's probably drunk, I thought. Or maybe he's on something. I looked back at my phone, turning up the volume on my music. I was listening to a heavy metal playlist, trying to drown out the creeping anxiety. 3 minutes passed. The board changed. Forest Park, 8 minutes. I couldn't help it. I looked to my left again. My stomach dropped. He was closer. He hadn't made a sound. I hadn't heard the click-clack of his shoes, but he had moved at least 20 feet closer to me. He was still facing the wall. He was still perfectly rigid. but now he was close enough that I could see the texture of his coat. It looked dry, almost stiff. I took my headphones out. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. "Hey man, you okay?" I called out. My voice echoed in the tunnel, sounding thin and weak. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn his head. He didn't even breathe. That's when I noticed the smell. It wafted over to me on a draft from the tunnel. It wasn't the usual subway smell. It smelled like wax. Like old crayons or melting candles mixed with something sharp like formaldehyde. I stood up. I decided I wasn't going to wait for the train on this side of the platform. I was going to walk past him, go up the stairs, and cross over to the other side. Or maybe just go back up to the street and call an Uber. I didn't care about the surge pricing anymore. I gripped my phone in my hand like a weapon and started walking. I had to pass behind him to get to the exit. As I got closer, the air seemed to get colder. The hum of the electric third rail seemed to buzz in my teeth. I kept my eyes locked on him, ready for him to lunge or scream. I was about 5 feet away when he started to turn. It wasn't a natural turn. He didn't pivot his feet. His upper body just rotated. It was jerky, like a stop-motion animation or a broken animatronic. Ratchet, ratchet, ratchet. I could hear the fabric of his suit straining. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, backing away toward the yellow safety strip. He completed the turn. He was facing me now. The fedora was pulled low, casting a shadow over his face. I expected to see a drunk businessman, or maybe a junkie with hollow eyes. He took a step forward, stepping into the direct glare of the overhead fluorescent light. I froze. I literally couldn't move. It felt like the signal from my brain to my legs had been severed. Where his face should have been, there was nothing. I don't mean it was shadowy. I mean there were no features. His skin was pale, the color of uncooked dough. It was completely smooth. There were no eye sockets, no eyebrows, no nose cartilage, no lips. It was just a blank, fleshy surface stretching from his hairline to his chin. It looked like someone had taken a photo of a human face in Photoshop and used the smudge tool until everything was erased. I stared at him for what felt like an eternity. My brain was trying to make sense of it. Is it a mask? I thought. It has to be a mask. But then the surface moved. Right where his mouth should have been, the skin rippled. It stretched and contorted, pushing outward as if something was trying to break through from the inside. A sound came from him. It didn't come from a throat, because he didn't have a mouth. It sounded like it was vibrating out of his chest. It was a low, humming groan. Then, the skin where his eyes should be indented. It sank inward, creating 2 shallow depressions, as if the flesh was collapsing into a skull that wasn't there. That broke the trance. I didn't scream. I didn't say a word. I turned and sprinted. I ran toward the turnstiles, vaulting over them because my hands were shaking too hard to find my card. I heard the click, clack behind me now. It was fast, much faster than a human should be able to run in dress shoes. I hit the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. I could hear him right behind me. I could hear that dry, rustling fabric and that smell of wax and formaldehyde choking me. I burst out onto Monroe Street, gasping for air. The cold wind hit my face, and I almost collapsed. I spun around, staring at the entrance to the subway. Nothing came up the stairs. I stood there for 10 minutes in the middle of the empty street, just watching the dark opening of the stairwell. I was waiting for that gray hat to rise out of the gloom. Eventually, a police cruiser turned the corner. I flagged them down. I didn't tell them about the face. I knew they'd lock me up for a psych eval. I just told them there was a guy in the station with a knife acting crazy. 2 officers went down. I waited by the car. They came back up 5 minutes later, looking annoyed. "Station's empty, kid," the older cop said. "We checked the platform, the bathrooms, everything. Nobody down there." "But I saw him," I stammered. "Gray suit, fedora." The cop paused, looking at his partner. "Weird," he muttered. "What?" I asked. "Nothing," the cop said, opening his car door. "Just, the janitor said he found a pile of clothes on the platform earlier tonight. Old stuff, gray suit. Said it looked like someone just melted out of them." I never took the train again. I quit my job at the law firm 2 weeks later because I couldn't handle being downtown after dark. I moved to the suburbs and got a job in IT. But here is the part that keeps me up at night. About a year ago, I was at a wedding. It was a nice reception, crowded, lots of people dancing. I was standing near the back, drinking a beer, watching the guests. Across the room near the exit, I saw a man. He was wearing a gray suit. He was wearing a fedora. He was standing perfectly still, facing the wall, while everyone else partied around him. I blinked, and he was gone. I tried to tell myself it was just PTSD, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, as I was leaving the reception hall, walking to my car in the parking lot, I smelled it. That distinct, sharp smell of melting wax and formaldehyde. And on the windshield of my car, written in the condensation, was a simple circle. And inside the circle, where the eyes and mouth should have been, the glass was perfectly, smoothly wiped clean.